Episode 16. Why immigrants make things better. Basically, why do the Japanese make things better than the original inventors? Here's a question. Why do the Japanese make stuff better than the countries who originally created them? Here's some examples. Think about technology. The tape recorder. Think about the 1980s movie called Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, Burt Young, Ned Beatty, and I want to say Paxton Whitehead, as well as Sally Kellerman. The Sony versus Panasonic, let's see, anything. Remember the tape cassette players, the Walkmans, the Iowa, for example. Pencil sharpeners, such as Matsushita or National. Watches, Seiko Citizen Orient, with the Japanese movement that's it's pretty comparable to what the Swiss make, only for a fraction of the price. Think about drinks. Yamazaki whiskey versus Scottish Highland single malt whiskey. There's a bunch of people in Scotland, in the Highlands, who are probably screaming like little schoolgirls right about now with me saying something like this. But the Japanese, if they actually won the worldwide award, I think it was in 2000, it was in the 2010s, beating out the Scottish. They clearly they got something good going on. Foods. You go to Japan, you look for, let's say, their version of a pastry. Cakes, eclairs, for example. It's basically either smoother, richer, creamier, or something that's slightly more refined or better than the original invention. Cars. Think about Toyota, Lexus, Nissan, let's say Infiniti. In the 1980s, 70s and 80s, they essentially took what the Americans essentially owned and dominated and came up with something that was much better, much more economical, much more reliable. Swords, well, the katana. When you think about the katana, that's actually made with two different types of metal alloys that are, metals that are essentially just sandwiched together, where the harder edge, let's see, does the cutting, and the softer backing absorbs the blows. I'm sure the English probably didn't think about that with their long swords. Comic books, anime. You go to the Barnes & Noble store, that's a bookstore somewhere in the United States, you're going to find a separate section for Japanese anime. Not so much as for regular comic books that are published in America. You have to go to a comic book store for something like that. Video games, Nintendo, Sega, and at one time TurboGrafx-16. Think about musical instruments. The guitars. Well, Yamaha, famous for pianos, violin, yes, motorcycles too. One of their electric guitars called the Attitude series. It's pretty comparable to a Fender, so Stratocaster, at least the made in Mexico versions. Alvarez, Yari, acoustic guitars. Not to mention the Ibanez, Joe Satriani, at least the JS1000, Joe Satriani 1000 series, with a basswood body. And speaking of violins, Yamaha violins, Suzuki Method, was worldwide renowned for a specific reason. Piano, Yamaha Clavinova. The fact that some of those Clavinovas, the prices are essentially becoming more, achieving more parity with a Steinway, that's pretty significant. So, if it's true that the Japanese do take something that someone else has made and make it better, why is this? Well, here's one thing to think about. The Japanese are obsessed, or that they are essentially a very obsessive culture. A lot of this is driven by a form of Confucianism, where perfection is achieved by achieving perfection. It sounds rather circular, but by constantly chasing perfection, think about constant refinement or the Kaizen philosophy, if you will, they're never satisfied. A colleague of mine, many years ago once said, if you go to any of the major cities, Tokyo, Kyoto, for example, go to a hotel and listen to the house band, who, you could just close your eyes, all of a sudden, you're essentially listening to a Beatles album, from soup to nuts, from start to finish. And then all of a sudden, when the house band is done with a set, they only speak Japanese because they claim they don't speak English. although they basically sang the Beatles repertoire, let's say the White Album or Revolver, just like us, just like how it was recorded. Now, here's something for you folks to keep in mind. The Japanese, they don't necessarily do this with everything, simply because if they did, then the world market would be a really sad place. And the American electric guitars, the American acoustic guitars, they would not have the current dominance via Gibson, Fender, Taylor, for example, that the Japanese would have if the Japanese really have continue to make things better than what everybody else can. So, and then the other thing to keep in mind is, even though the Japanese, they do make something that's more reliable or better, sometimes they're done, other times they're not done. And once in a while, the Japanese, they do invent something on their own that no one else has come up with that essentially exceeds their world expectations. So, for example, think about BB guns. That's right, you'll shoot your eye out kind of a thing. Japan has very strict laws when it comes to firearms. So I'm pretty sure that a BB gun in Japan would be severely frowned upon, culturally, if not legally. So what do? They came up with their own version of airsoft, or their own version of it, which would meet, let's see, the country's legal limits. Only so many joules per round, if you will. And rather than using metal pellets, 6mm plastic or ceramic pellets, usually weighing anywhere between 0.12 to 0.20 grams per round. And it's become a worldwide phenomenon, especially with manufacturers such as Tokyo Marui. Also, think about the woodworking techniques. The Japanese, they were clearly building things out of wood, especially with, let's see, Japanese cedar, or in Japanese language, sugi. They were isolated as a country for several hundred years, so they clearly had to come up with their own woodworking techniques. And this shows because when you look at the English slash British way of cutting wood, it's push cut, whereas with the Japanese, the blade is thinner and it's pull cut. And and this technique applies to Japanese saws such as ryoba, dozuki, for example. So it's not to say that the Japanese constantly, constantly are doing things better than what the original country, the countries of origin, have invented in the first place. But once in a while, when they come up with something that's really good, and it just becomes really well accepted worldwide, such as Yamazaki whiskey, Ibanez guitars, Yamaha, especially the Billy Sheehan basses. And by the way, it wasn't the Yamaha Attitude guitars I was thinking of. It was the Yamaha Pacifica series. That's more comparable to a Fender Stratocaster made in Mexico version. Parody to parody, for example. So that's it. It's all about being very meticulous, being obsessive, driven by the constant refinement is necessary to achieve perfection, or Kaizen as philosophy. All right, here's the Kevin Bacon game. To Mr. Big band fans worldwide, thanks to Makita cordless drills and Lean Into It album, you basically have 3 degrees of separation between an American, super rock band, Mr. Big, made up of, back then, Pat Torfby, Paul Gilbert, Billy Sheehan, and Eric Martin. And you basically have 3 degrees of separation between the band and Japan. Thank you. Until next time.